It was the 14th of January, 1888, when the mercury plummeted to 45 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit across the Dakota Territory. Gale force winds howled with such ferocity that they actually ripped iron nails straight out of the timber walls. Livestock froze to death right inside their own barns. Even the toughest men in the county shed tears of sheer helplessness as their loved ones shivered uncontrollably underneath a dozen damp, moisture-soaked quilts. Yet, on a modest homestead sitting just east of Millerton, inside an unassuming cabin with smoke rising steadily from its chimney, a 52-year-old widow named Mira Lindström slumbered peacefully beneath just a single woolen blanket. Her hearth fire burned evenly and strong. The timber was dry, flawlessly dry. Meanwhile, outdoors, the very same neighbors who had mocked her apparent madness just months prior were now pounding on her front door with frostbitten knuckles, begging for a share of the salvation she had crafted with her own bare hands. However, to fully grasp how an uneducated widow transformed into the savior of an entire settlement, we must journey back to the autumn of 1887, which is when this whole ordeal began. September had ushered in its usual golden promises. It had only been 3 months since Mira Lindström became a widow. Her late husband, Henrik, succumbed to pneumonia after toiling in the freezing rain to patch up the barn's roof. He departed this world, leaving behind an $87 bank debt, 10 acres of unplowed fields, and a timber cabin that groaned under the weight of every passing gust. Both of Mira's sons had already headed out west, chasing dreams of striking gold over in Montana. She found herself entirely on her own. The woman faced merely 2 choices: liquidate her meager assets and relocate to Minneapolis with her sister, or hold her ground and brave the looming winter. The brutal Dakota winters showed zero mercy to the frail. Everyone in the territory knew that fact. Moreover, a solitary woman, lacking a husband, strong offspring, or financial means, was viewed as practically living on borrowed time before freezing to death. Nevertheless, Meera recollected a specific memory. It was a tale her grandfather, Lars Thoresen, used to share during her childhood back in Norway. Old Lars survived to the ripe age of 92 up in the northern peaks, where the freezing season dragged on for 8 solid months, and the daylight vanished altogether. He had vividly described the ancient subterranean cellars, carved deep into the soil, utilized to hoard not merely provisions, but firewood as well. The dirt, Lars used to croak in his gravelly tone, simply never freezes past a depth of around 3 feet. Furthermore, if you store the logs below the surface, inside a well-aerated yet shielded chamber, they will never soak up the dampness of the frigid atmosphere. Soggy timber refuses to catch fire. Wet kindling merely generates thick smoke, burns through twice as much material, and ultimately leaves a homestead freezing cold and coated in black soot. On the flip side, parched wood, safeguarded like a buried treasure, blazes pure, scorching hot, and relentlessly steady. Consequently, Meera made the firm decision to dig out a wood cellar. This wasn't meant to be a living basement, nor a storm shelter like the ones folks erected for twisters, but rather an underground vault engineered exclusively to keep her singular life-saving resource immaculately dry throughout the lethal, icy months. She was well aware that the locals wouldn't comprehend her logic. She fully expected them to mock her. However, Henrik had perished precisely because he got soaked to the bone. She absolutely refused to die from a lack of warmth. The initial individual to find out about her plan was Thomas Whitfield, the wealthiest merchant in all of Millerton. Thomas was the proud owner of the general store, a couple of rental properties, and a bustling livery stable housing a dozen horses. Once Meera requested to borrow a heavy-duty shovel alongside a wheelbarrow, the man naturally inquired about their intended purpose. She gave him the honest answer. Whitfield fell dead silent for a brief second, only to erupt into a belly laugh so booming it rattled the glass jars sitting on his counters. "Ma'am," he chuckled, That is hands down the most foolish notion I've caught wind of in 2 decades. Firewood gets stored inside a proper shed, stacked neatly against the south-facing wall. Every sane person knows that. Are you genuinely planning to bury your logs in the dirt like a rotting corpse? Meera offered zero response. She merely grabbed the requested implements and handed over the 50-cent rental fee. The next skeptic in line was Pastor Heinrich Müller, a heavily built German fellow who ran the modest wooden Lutheran chapel right in the heart of town. Heinrich paid Meera a visit roughly a week later, right around the time she had already carved out about 3 feet of depth into the clay-heavy terrain located behind her cabin. "Sister Lindström," he announced in a deep baritone, "I have been hearing some rather troubling gossip. Word around town is that you are hollowing out a cavern. Dens are meant for wild beasts, certainly not for God-fearing Christians. The Almighty blessed us with daylight and the intellect to erect respectable buildings. Why do you insist on burrowing through the muck like a blind mole?" Meera simply brushed the caked mud off her skirt and replied evenly, "Reverend, the Lord also equipped me with a functioning mind and 2 capable hands. Should I fail to utilize them, he will surely judge me for squandering his gifts." Heinrich scowled deeply, muttered a quick prayer in his native German tongue, and wandered off, shaking his head in dismay. The third vocal opponent proved to be Captain John Morrison, a grizzled Civil War veteran who had successfully endured 3 Dakota winters, and thus viewed himself as the ultimate authority on frontier survival. Morrison spent his afternoons down at the local saloon, spinning yarns about how he had single-handedly kept his entire platoon from freezing by applying tactical military maneuvers. Upon catching wind of Meera's peculiar undertaking, he marched straight over to her acreage, planted his boots at the rim of the pit, and spat a stream of chewing tobacco right down into the hollow. "Lady," he stated with palpable disdain, "I have watched men far tougher than you drop dead over utterly idiotic schemes. This trench is practically worthless. The ground is going to swamp entirely once the spring thaw hits. Tree roots will shatter whatever flimsy roof you attempt to throw over it. And even if by some act of God it actually holds up, the vermin and rattlesnakes will swiftly turn your precious timber into a breeding nest." Meera looked him dead in the eye and plainly stated, "Then I suppose I will just have to build it properly." Morrison let out a bitter chuckle and strutted away. Yet, Meera wasn't breaking her back to sway anyone's opinion. She labored purely to stay alive. Plus, within the ancestral culture of her forefathers, vanity was deemed a lavish indulgence reserved exclusively for the wealthy elite. The destitute, the modest folk, the ones who truly understood the bone-chilling ache of winter, recognized that the sole verdict carrying any real weight belonged to Mother Nature, and the natural world, icy and entirely apathetic, never ever excused hubris. If you happen to believe that the sagacity of our elders holds far more value than the ego of modern society, make sure to hit that subscribe button for this channel. We are actively salvaging the very historical accounts that the passage of time attempted to erase. The widow kept digging for 18 straight days. Every single morning, well before daybreak, she would tie her hair back into a severe bun, slip into Henrik's worn-out trousers, and climb down into the crater armed with her spade. The Dakota soil proved to be incredibly unforgiving. The initial 20 inches consisted of a tacky clay that clung to her iron blade, much like thick bread dough. Following that layer came a bed of gravel heavily mixed with fist-sized river rocks. Once she hit about 5 feet down, the dirt transitioned into a darker shade, bordering on pitch black, retaining moisture, yet remaining densely packed. That specific terrain was the exact layer that famously avoided freezing over. It was the very earth her forefathers understood intimately. Her blueprint remained straightforward, yet highly exact. It formed a rectangular shape measuring 10 feet in length by roughly 6.5 feet across, dug straight down to a depth of roughly 6.5 feet. Going any lower was out of the question, given she had to haul the timber up and down without relying on a complicated pulley rig. Pushing it any wider was equally impossible, since the overhead structure had to endure the heavy load of the dirt above without caving in. Meera had carefully studied her grandfather's sketches, which were essentially rough doodles etched into the margins of an ancestral Bible she had hauled all the way from Norway. She thoroughly grasped that the true trick wasn't merely the depth of the pit, but rather the highly regulated airflow and proper thermal insulation. Upon finishing the excavation phase, she proceeded to erect the interior boundaries. Lacking the funds to purchase proper brickwork, she utilized whatever was available. 4-inch thick cottonwood logs, chopped into 6.5-foot segments and driven straight down into the dirt, much like a defensive palisade. She then plugged the gaps wedged between those timbers using a concoction made of raw clay, dried prairie grass, and equine manure. That specific compound eventually cured to be as rock-solid as concrete, rendering the walls entirely waterproof. She had picked up that handy method from a Mexican household that had drifted through Millerton years prior while assembling livestock pens. Those folks referred to the sticky blend as primitive cob. It proved highly effective. The overhead covering turned out to be the most grueling phase. Meera felled 6 solid spruce beams, each measuring roughly 4 inches thick and stretching out to nearly 12 feet in length. She dragged them individually from the nearby woods, lashed securely to her waist with a thick rope, trudging forward bent double like a draft ox. The widow laid out the heavy rafters across the rectangular pit, spacing them about 16 inches apart from one another. Sitting right atop those supports, she arranged a thick layer of tightly interwoven twigs and branches. Directly over that brushwork, she unrolled a battered canvas tarp that had previously served as the covering for Henrik's wagon. Finally, to top off the tarp, she piled on roughly 20 inches of loose soil and thick sod. The combined burden was absolutely massive, yet since it was dispersed evenly, the spruce logs held firm without so much as a creak. The most crucial element of all, however, was the airflow. Absent proper circulation, dampness would inevitably pool up, leading to the rapid rotting of the timber. On the other hand, excessive drafts would simply invite the freezing chill and drifting snow inside. To solve this, Meera rigged up a pair of tin ventilation pipes, scavenged from an ancient derelict grain silo. She positioned one chute at either end of the dugout, leaving them protruding roughly 12 inches above the surface of the yard. These cylinders featured adjustable caps that she could easily tweak from the surface using a long wooden pole. Whenever the outdoor breeze was crisp and dry, she would prop the covers wide open. Should a snowstorm or heavy downpour roll in, she would promptly slide them half shut. The resulting slow circulation of the crisp, frigid winter draft would methodically wick away any lingering moisture, all without managing to freeze the log pile. The primary entryway consisted of a reinforced timber trapdoor fitted with heavy iron hinges, easily reachable straight from the exterior of her cabin. She actually dug out a short access passageway, extending about 3 feet in length, completely outfitted with sturdy stone steps. A basic padlock secured the hatch, although it wasn't installed out of any fear of local thieves, but strictly to prevent roaming critters from prying it open. The entire expense for erecting this structure totaled a precise $14.60. Meera maintained an incredibly strict ledger inside a small notebook. She tallied $8 for the heavy hinges, the lock mechanism, and a box of iron nails. The tool rentals set her back exactly $3. Another $2.60 went toward a jug of linseed oil, which she generously applied to waterproof the overhead roof beams. Absolutely every other aspect of the project was purely sweat, cleverness, and sheer time. While the widow busied herself assembling her subterranean vault, her fellow townsfolk were actively putting together their own frosty weather preparations. Wealthy Thomas Whitfield went ahead and hired a trio of laborers to throw up a brand new firewood shack right adjacent to his primary residence. The resulting outbuilding boasted crimson-painted siding, a heavily slanted roof sporting shingles shipped all the way from Minnesota, and authentic glass windows so he could keep a watchful eye on his fuel supply from the sheer comfort of his parlor. The final price tag hit a whopping $120. Thomas beamed with absolute pride. He loudly boasted that his fancy shed stood as definitive proof of refined civilization thriving amid an untamed wilderness. Meanwhile, Reverend Heinrich Müller opted to simply heap his chopped wood into a massive mound pressed against his home's southern facade, entirely draped in a hefty canvas weighed down by heavy fieldstones. This represented the conventional approach, the exact routine everybody followed, the time-honored method essentially blessed by countless generations of European farmers. Why bother tinkering with innovation when the ancient ways supposedly held up just fine? Staying totally true to his strict tactical mindset, Captain Morrison formulated what he dubbed a combustible rotation system. He established a trio of separate lumber stacks positioned at varying spots across his acreage, outfitting each one with its own distinct tarp. His underlying theory banked on the fact that should one pile get soaked, he would perpetually rely on two solid backups. The strategy appeared highly logical, wonderfully organized, and ultimately completely worthless, a fact he was destined to uncover shortly. Throughout those grueling weeks of manual labor, Meera managed to shed nearly 15 pounds. Her palms developed calluses of such thickness that she could literally grab a thorny briar branch without registering the slightest hint of pain. Her spine throbbed viciously every single evening, yet she continuously treated the aches by rubbing in an herbal salve whipped up from crushed ginger root and rendered goose fat, representing yet another remedy passed down from her grandmother. She scraped by on a mere 5 hours of slumber, waking up completely stiff, but stubbornly pushed forward with her chores regardless. Naturally, flashes of deep hesitation did creep in. One evening, while resting on the edge of her fully dug crater and staring up at the October constellations, Meera found herself questioning if the townsfolk had actually been right all along. Perhaps this entire endeavor genuinely was sheer lunacy. Maybe she was foolishly squandering her precious vigor on a makeshift structure that was bound to cave in the moment the initial blizzard hit. But then the vivid memory of old Lars's wisdom echoed back to her. The dirt never deceives anyone, Meera. Human beings are the ones who tell lies. Passing trends are full of falsehoods. However, the sheer earth, the raw physics, the exact mechanics of how heat travels and moisture turns to ice, those elements remain undeniably truthful. Place your ultimate faith in the ground below. Once October finally drew to a close, Meera fully stocked her subterranean cellar with logs. She had devoted the entirety of September to chopping down lifeless timber within the neighboring woods, harvesting mostly sturdy oak and cottonwood. The widow sliced them into neat 16-inch segments, split them cleanly using a heavy axe, and allowed the pieces to bake underneath the sunlight for 3 solid weeks. Afterward, utilizing that borrowed wheelbarrow, she ferried every single batch straight over to her dugout. She would carefully descend those rocky stairs, meticulously stack the split wood tight against the earthen boundaries, intentionally keeping the middle area completely clear to allow the breeze to drift through. Packing the chamber to the brim ended up eating an entire week of her time. By the time she wrapped up the grueling task, she possessed an adequate supply of fuel to guarantee non-stop warmth for roughly 4 solid months. She firmly secured the heavy trapdoor. The widow twisted those tin ventilation caps until they rested right at the halfway mark. And then she simply bided her time. November arrived, bringing premature frosts. The initial snowfall drifted down on the 6th of the month, falling light and almost purely decorative. Youngsters frolicked in the fresh powder. The local women busied themselves putting up preserves. Husbands double-checked their flues and storage outbuildings. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Yet the elders, those seasoned folks who had endured 40 or 50 freezing seasons in these parts, merely squinted at the heavens and kept their mouths shut. There was a distinct, peculiar feel to the atmosphere. An eerie stillness hovered around. The flocks of birds had flown south a full fortnight earlier than their usual schedule. Timber wolves could be heard howling noticeably closer to the settlement. Mother Nature was acutely aware of a secret that mankind had yet to grasp. The initial bout of genuine, bone-chilling frost struck on November 22nd. Overnight, the thermometer plunged to around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Merchant Thomas Whitfield fired up his brand-new cast-iron parlor stove, freshly shipped all the way from Chicago, only to realize that the logs inside his gorgeous new shack were entirely soaked. Sure, the structure boasted glass panes, but those very same windows had actively invited the damp autumn drafts inside. The raw timber had sucked up the moisture much like a dry sponge. Once he tossed the pieces into the firebox, they generated far more thick smoke than actual warmth. His entire household was hacking and coughing. Everyone's eyes watered continuously. Thomas was forced to crack the sashes just to air out the room, which naturally let the freezing chill pour right in. It was an absolute losing battle. He ended up burning through twice the anticipated amount of fuel merely to sustain a barely acceptable indoor temperature. Reverend Heinrich Müller swiftly discovered that his conventional woodpile, regardless of the heavy canvas tarp, had likewise been compromised. The drifting snow had managed to sneak its way right between the fabric covering and the logs. The slight daytime warmth would melt that powder, allowing the runoff to trickle down through the stack, and then the whole mess would freeze solid once nightfall hit. His supply wasn't merely damp, it was essentially entombed in ice. Whenever he attempted to split a piece, he would find frozen crystals wedged deep inside the wood grain. It caught fire terribly, producing a relentless stream of pitch-black soot. Heinrich developed a nasty cough. It was a dry, unyielding hack that seemed to grow steadily worse with each passing evening. Captain Morrison, relying on his clever three-pile system, ran headfirst into an entirely different hurdle. One of his stacks happened to sit in a slight depression where the melted runoff naturally pooled up. It was rendered entirely worthless. The second heap took the brunt of the northern gales, which blew with such sheer force that they ripped the top clean off and scattered the heavy logs all across his property. The third mound, his ultimate fallback, remained in decent shape, yet it amounted to barely a third of the fuel he actually required to survive the entire season. The great Morrison, the rugged veteran who had weathered 3 brutal winters and openly mocked the townspeople, was suddenly rationing his timber, much like a greedy miser pinching his copper pennies. All the while, over at Mira's homestead, her hearth fire burned flawlessly. Every single afternoon, right before twilight hit, the widow would flip open her cellar hatch. The draft that drifted upward felt icy, yet it was remarkably arid. She would descend those rocky steps carrying her kerosene lantern. Her chopped timber sat precisely the way she had stacked it, bone dry to the touch, devoid of any frost, entirely free of mildew, without the faintest whiff of mustiness. She would gather up 6 or 7 hefty pieces, haul them to the surface inside a woven wicker basket, latch the trapdoor shut, and proceed to stoke her stove. The parched wood blazed with a brilliant blue and yellow flame, burning incredibly clean and entirely smokeless. The resulting warmth was both blistering and instantaneous. Meera easily kept her cabin at a perfectly cozy temperature, while burning through half the amount of fuel her peers were currently wasting. While the rest of the town woke up inside soot-choked rooms with burning lungs, she started her mornings in a toasty, highly breathable atmosphere. Right at the beginning of December, Thomas Whitfield decided to pay her a call. It was a dreary afternoon, featuring a sky weighed down by low-hanging, slate-colored clouds. Thomas rapped on her front door with knuckles turned raw and red by the biting chill. Meera cracked the door open. The merchant peered inside the dwelling, instantly registering the wave of heat and the pristine air quality, and sheer bewilderment washed over his features. "Mrs. Lindström," he began, his tone lacking its previous arrogance, "I have observed that your smokestack is barely producing any exhaust." Are you simply choosing not to light a fire at all? Meera offered a faint, polite smile. I kindle a blaze every single day, mister. Whitfield. It's just that my timber burns purely. Thomas knitted his brow. That is simply impossible. Every single log in the entire county is soaking wet this season. It is just the nature of the current weather. Meera offered absolutely no rebuttal. Whitfield lingered, expecting some sort of clarification. None was provided. At last, nursing a bruised ego, he mumbled a quick goodbye and wandered off. However, he could not bring himself to leave without casting a glance over his shoulder. And as he peeked back, he caught sight of that modest timber hatch sitting flush with the ground, right near the cabin wall. He spotted those tin ventilation pipes barely poking up out of the frost-coated yard. And suddenly, the gears in his mind slowly started piecing the puzzle together. Yet, a man's pride acts as an incredibly heavy suit of armor. Stripping it off demands far more bravery than strapping it on in the first place. Thomas simply wasn't prepared to do so quite yet. The month of December crept forward, much like a sluggish, stalking predator. The freezing conditions grew even more severe. The daylight hours shrank down until the locals were left with barely 6 hours of dull, grayish illumination. Households barricaded themselves indoors, tossing logs into the fire, whispering prayers, and simply waiting it out. The youngsters fell ill on a regular basis. The elderly began coughing up traces of blood. It was shaping up to be a fairly standard winter out in the Dakota Territory. Incredibly harsh, yet ultimately survivable. However, the absolute worst was still looming on the horizon. During the Christmas Eve congregation, Reverend Heinrich Müller delivered a highly unusual public statement right in the middle of his sermon. "Brothers and sisters," he croaked, his voice raspy from the constant hacking, "I must openly admit to my own foolishness. I hastily condemned a widowed woman simply because she chose to honor the knowledge of her forefathers. I labeled as lunacy what I now clearly recognize as profound foresight. Sister Lindström, if you are sitting among us today, I humbly beg for your forgiveness." Meera happened to be seated squarely in the back pew, just as she always did. She offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, yet she didn't utter a single syllable. Heinrich pressed on. "I will not be altering my own storage methods this season, mainly because it is far too late to do so. However, come next autumn, I fully intend to dig out the exact structure she has built. And I strongly urge every single one of you to follow suit." A wave of hushed whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. A handful of folks nodded in agreement. Others, primarily the most stubborn and vain men in the room, maintained a stony silence. Captain Morrison actually stood up and marched right out of the chapel well before the religious service had even concluded. His ego absolutely could not stomach hearing high praise directed at the very woman he had openly branded as an idiot. But Mother Nature wasn't about to pause her plans just to wait for mankind to settle their petty disputes. The wild elements operated on their own strict timetable, and on the 9th day of January, 1888, the heavens finally unleashed their absolute wrath. That particular morning kicked off with a deeply unsettling stillness. The thermometer hovered right around 14 degrees Fahrenheit, which felt borderline balmy for a January day. The sky above hung like a sheet of solid steel gray, utterly devoid of any breeze. Husbands ventured out into the timberlands to chop extra fuel. Wives took advantage of the calm to wash the household linens. Kids chased each other across the hard-packed snowdrifts. It had all the makings of a perfectly ordinary winter afternoon. Right around 2 o'clock, the prevailing breeze suddenly shifted. It swept down from the north, feeling much like the icy breath escaping the lungs of a frozen giant. In a mere 15 minutes, the air plummeted by nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Within a single hour, it had dropped over 70 degrees. By 4 in the afternoon, right when the sun ought to be just starting its evening dip, The entire landscape was plunged into an unnaturally early darkness. This wasn't because dusk had actually settled in, but rather due to a towering wall of driving snow and gale-force winds, so incredibly thick it looked like solid rock, completely swallowing up the horizon line. The infamous Great Blizzard of 1888 had officially struck. The gales blasted at a velocity that no earthly gauge could accurately record. In the aftermath, the folks who lived to tell the tale would estimate wind gusts topping 60 miles per hour. The powder didn't merely drift downwards, it blasted sideways, stinging the flesh like frozen white shrapnel. Sightlines were instantly reduced to absolutely nothing. Trudging a mere 15 feet away from your own front porch guaranteed you would vanish into a blinding sub-zero hellscape. Those husbands who had wandered into the timberlands to fetch logs simply never made it back home. A handful of their bodies would be uncovered months later, frozen solid just yards away from their own doorsteps, having wandered in lethal circles until the end. Thomas Whitfield was busy managing his general store when the whiteout initially hit. He quickly bolted the heavy doors, locked down the glass sashes, and bunkered down with his wife and children inside the rear storage room. The merchant sparked up his cast-iron heater and began feeding it logs. However, trying to burn waterlogged timber amid such brutal plunging temperatures proved to be an exercise in futility. The ambient heat inside the shop steadily drained away without mercy. His little ones shook violently while buried beneath every single quilt the family owned. His wife wept without making a sound. Thomas stubbornly tossed chunk after chunk into the firebox, desperately feeding a blaze that radiated virtually zero warmth. By the stroke of midnight, his stockpile of fuel had dwindled down to exactly half. And the blizzard was really only just warming up. Reverend Heinrich Müller found himself completely alone inside his parsonage, located right beside the chapel. His nasty hack had rapidly devolved into a deep, violently wet rattle in his chest. He desperately attempted to spark up his stove, but the roaring gales outside were blasting with such immense power that they generated a massive backdraft straight down his flue. The thick exhaust was being forced directly into his living quarters, instead of venting outward. Heinrich choked and coughed until his stomach actually heaved. He was forced to smother the flames entirely. He figured freezing to death was a much kinder fate than suffocating on thick soot. The Reverend cocooned himself in every blanket he could find, crawled into his mattress, and repeatedly mumbled the Lord's Prayer on a continuous loop. Captain Morrison had locked down his homestead like an impenetrable military stronghold. He hammered thick wooden planks over every single glass pane. He stuffed old rags into the drafty cracks along the walls. Yet, the one glaring detail he neglected to factor in was that his roof, shoddily erected by cut-rate laborers, would quickly begin to buckle beneath the crushing weight of the drifting powder. Right around 3 in the morning, a horrifying splintering noise echoed through the cabin. A primary support rafter snapped clean in half. Massive clumps of snow immediately started pouring straight down through the gaping wound in his ceiling. Freezing slush, mixed with the sub-zero drafts, dripped directly onto his hot stove, killing the fire instantly. Morrison scrambled to spark it back to life, but his remaining stockpile of logs was completely encased in ice and buried under the drifts. It simply refused to catch a spark. Sheer, unadulterated panic slammed into his chest like a physical punch. Here he was, the grizzled combat veteran, the ultimate survivor, the frontier expert, sitting on the verge of freezing to death inside his very own parlor. Over at Meera's modest property, the blizzard roaring outside sounded much like 1,000 screeching demons. However, safely indoors, everything was functioning perfectly. She had painstakingly winterproofed her entire cabin well before the first freeze ever hit. She had carefully caulked every single splintered seam using river mud and dried moss. She had proactively shored up her rafters with extra timber supports. Her glass panes were shielded behind thick, heavy-duty wooden shutters. Her entryway featured a double-layered weather seal, and her iron stove, continuously fueled by immaculately parched logs, roared with the fiery intensity of a dragon's heart. Meera felt absolutely no terror. She had weathered her fair share of vicious blizzards back in the day. She was fully aware that this brutal tempest would eventually blow over. The widow simply grabbed her worn Bible, pulled up a chair next to the radiating iron, and quietly read her scriptures by candlelight. Every so often she would wander down into her cellar pit and haul up a fresh load of wood. Her access hatch was partially buried beneath a heavy drift, but she managed to shove it open without much of a struggle. Her timber remained in absolutely flawless condition, bone dry, primed to burn, and perfectly dependable. Right around 5 in the morning on January 10th, she suddenly heard a frantic pounding at her door. These weren't the polite taps of a casual neighbor stopping by, but rather the frantic, desperate blows of someone hovering right on the edge of the grave. Meera struggled to pry the heavy door open, shoving fiercely against the howling gales and the packed powder. Standing right there on her porch, coated head to toe in thick frost, much like a pale ghost, stood Thomas Whitfield's wife, tightly clutching her 3 children. The poor woman was completely incapable of uttering a single word. Her mouth had turned a sickening shade of blue. The little ones were wailing, yet crying no tears, simply because the moisture was freezing solid against their cheeks before it could even fall. Meera immediately hauled the entire family inside her cabin. She slammed the heavy timber door shut behind them. She rapidly peeled off their stiff, ice-caked garments. She bundled them all up tightly inside warm, dry quilts, right next to the roaring hearth. The widow brewed them some piping hot tea, sweetened with a spoonful of honey. The kids were shaking with violent spasms, but very gradually, the intense, radiating warmth of the room started breathing life right back into their tiny bodies. Mrs. Whitfield eventually thawed out enough to string a sentence together. "Thomas is doing everything he can to make it over here," she choked out in a raspy whisper. "Our stove completely died out. My babies were freezing to death right in front of me. Please help us." Meera didn't bother offering any verbal reassurances. She merely marched straight down into her subterranean vault, hauled up another massive load of timber, and furiously stoked the flames until a deep, penetrating heat soaked into every single corner of her homestead. Roughly an hour later, Thomas Whitfield came stumbling through the door. He had very nearly perished along the way. The man had forced himself to trudge over 200 yards through a blizzard that had already slaughtered guys twice as tough as him. The moment he breached the threshold, he immediately collapsed right onto his kneecaps. His fingertips had already turned a horrifying shade of black, showing the early stages of severe frostbite. Meera quickly submerged his hands into a basin of lukewarm water, carefully avoiding anything boiling hot, in order to stave off permanent nerve damage. Thomas sobbed openly. He wasn't weeping from the agonizing physical pain, but rather from a crushing sense of utter humiliation. "You were right all along," he kept whispering through his tears. "Dear God above, you were entirely right." Fast forward to 8 o'clock in the morning, and Reverend Heinrich Müller finally showed up, quite literally crawling his way through the drifts. He had completely lost the ability to stand upright. He was violently hacking up specks of blood. Meera dragged him close to the stove's radiant heat and forced him to swallow some steaming broth. Heinrich eventually regained just enough clarity to look her dead in the eyes. "Please forgive my arrogance," he pleaded. Meera simply shook her head in response. "There isn't a single thing to forgive, Reverend. Just a few hard lessons we all needed to learn." By 10 in the morning, Captain Morrison finally dragged himself onto her porch. He was physically supporting a pair of neighboring farmers he had stumbled across while wandering through the whiteout. Morrison's entire roof had caved in under the massive drifts. All 3 of those tough men were hovering precariously on the brink of lethal hypothermia. Meera welcomed every single one of them inside. her tiny, unassuming cabin, a structure the rest of the town had previously sneered at as utterly pathetic, was currently providing life-saving shelter to 14 freezing souls. And strictly owing to a buried pit fully stocked with bone-dry logs, every last one of them lived to see another day. The raging blizzard hammered the territory for 3 uninterrupted days. That amounted to 72 agonizing hours of howling gales, blinding powder, and a genuinely lethal freeze. The absolute lowest recorded temperature bottomed out at around 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Across the wider county, a total of 17 locals tragically froze to death. 53 head of cattle were lost to the ice. An uncountable tally of fine horses and swine simply perished in their pens. 5 separate homesteads literally collapsed under the strain. However, inside Mira Lindström's cozy dwelling, not a single soul passed away. Not one person sustained permanent, crippling frostbite. Nobody suffered from gnawing hunger or a lack of deep, comforting warmth. Once the winter sun finally broke through the clouds, the entire landscape looked utterly alien. The freshly packed drifts easily reached a grown man's waistline. The heavy timber was bowed entirely over, looking much like tightly strung archery bows. The settlement of Millerton closely resembled an eerie, blindingly white graveyard. Yet, billowing straight out of Mira's chimney stack, a steady, unbroken ribbon of exhaust floated upwards. Incredibly pure exhaust, the distinct, sweet-smelling smoke of flawlessly parched timber. The 14 rescued individuals slowly filed out onto her porch in total silence. They stared out across the utterly ruined frontier. They turned to stare at the incredibly humble shack that had magically kept them breathing. They locked eyes with the 52-year-old widow who had stubbornly ignored their relentless mockery. Thomas Whitfield happened to be the very first one to break the heavy quiet. "Mrs. Lindström," he rasped, his voice cracking with emotion. "Exactly how much money would it cost to hire you to teach me how to dig out one of those subterranean pits?" Meera flashed an incredibly weary smile. "It won't cost you a single dime, Mr. Whitfield. True knowledge isn't a commodity meant to be bartered away. It is strictly meant to be passed along." Over the ensuing months, as the Dakota territory slowly clawed its way back from the Great Blizzard, a profound shift took root within Millerton. Meera dedicated her late afternoons to actively tutoring anyone willing to sit and listen. She would lay out those rough sketches drawn by her grandfather. She would walk them through the incredibly basic physics surrounding the Earth's naturally consistent, unfreezing temperature layers. She actively guided them on how to accurately crunch the numbers for the ideal digging depth, the proper overall square footage, and the mandatory airflow systems. She never once asked for a single copper penny. She never demanded any sort of public praise or glory. She merely handed down the wisdom she possessed, exactly the way her forebears had done for countless generations before her. By the time the autumn of 1888 rolled around, 7 separate households across Millerton had already dug out their own wood cellars. Fast forward to the fall of 1889, and that number swelled to 23. Hitting 1890, the technique had actively spilled over into 3 neighboring counties. The major newspapers up in Fargo ended up printing a massive feature article proudly headlined, "Norwegian Wisdom Saves Countless Lives Across the Dakotas." A prominent engineering professor hailing from the University of Minnesota actually rode a train all the way down to Millerton purely to examine Meera's structural layout, eventually publishing a highly regarded academic paper detailing the sheer brilliance of subterranean fuel storage amid brutal, sub-zero climates. Yet, Meera never once chased after the spotlight. She carried right on residing inside her unassuming cabin, all by her lonesome, actively tending to her modest vegetable patch during the scorching summers, and quietly reading beside her blazing hearth all through the freezing winters. Henrik had sadly passed on, but his lingering spirit definitely survived through the sheer, unbreakable grit she had managed to unearth deep inside her own soul. her two boys finally wandered back from Montana in 1891, returning with absolutely zero gold nuggets, but packing plenty of wild yarns. They were utterly floored to discover that their very own mother had blossomed into an absolute folk legend across the entire territory. Reverend Heinrich Müller tragically never fully shook off that awful rattling hack. He sadly passed away during the freezing season of 1890. However, right before he breathed his last, he actively revised his final will and testament to bequeath a solid sum of cash over to Meera, acting out of profound gratitude for her sparing his life. The widow opted to spend those inherited funds on a massive stack of textbooks, immediately donating them to the tiny local schoolhouse, attaching just one strict stipulation. A handful of those volumes absolutely had to cover the topics of traditional old-world engineering and the ancestral wisdom handed down across various global cultures. Thomas Whitfield rapidly transformed into Meera's absolute, fiercest champion. He leveraged his considerable influence as the town's primary supplier to ship in specialized spades and heavy-duty trenching gear, actively selling the hardware at pure wholesale cost to absolutely any homestead eager to carve out their very own underground vault. The wealthy merchant never managed to shake off the crushing humiliation of that fateful evening, a night when his massive bank account and towering ego proved utterly useless in keeping his offspring breathing, while the ancient knowledge of a destitute widow successfully did the trick. Captain Morrison promptly liquidated his entire acreage and fled east towards Minnesota. He simply couldn't stomach residing in a tight-knit community where his massive vanity had been so brutally and publicly laid bare. Right before hitching up his wagon for good, he paid Meera one final visit. The veteran didn't offer up a whole lot of dialogue. He merely muttered, "I finally learned that years of experience without a shred of genuine humility amounts to nothing more than useless noise." Meera offered a knowing nod, and with that the captain rode off, emerging as a far wiser yet undeniably broken individual. Mira Lindström stubbornly held on until the ripe old age of 79. She passed away incredibly peacefully, right inside her own mattress during the dead of winter in 1915, resting inside a wonderfully toasty cabin backed up by a subterranean pit overflowing with bone-dry logs. At her burial service, well over 100 grateful folks turned up to pay their respects, many having traveled by rail from distant settlements. Every single mourner echoed the exact same sentiment. She actively proved to us all that surviving a disaster isn't dictated by the wealth you hoard, but entirely by the knowledge you carry inside your skull. And furthermore, that stored knowledge is absolutely worthless unless you are genuinely willing to learn it from the most unassuming, humble people around you. Believe it or not, her legendary timber dugout still stands intact today. The surrounding acreage traded owners numerous times over the decades, yet every subsequent buyer actively maintained that underground vault as a cherished historical landmark. Back in 1972, the North Dakota state government actually bolted a heavy bronze plaque onto the site, boldly stating, "Upon this exact spot, Mira Lindström actively proved that ancient, time-honored wisdom can easily outshine modern technology, provided it is applied with profound humility and exact precision." Yet Mira's genuine, lasting legacy isn't etched onto chunks of metal or buried inside boring academic essays. It lives on vibrantly within every single household that managed to survive a brutal freeze simply because someone, somewhere, caught wind of her incredible tale and ultimately decided that weathering the mockery of their ignorant neighbors was a tiny price to pay to keep their loved ones breathing. It continues to burn bright within every individual who was ever branded a lunatic for walking an unconventional path, yet stubbornly pushed forward regardless. Historical accounts, much like Meera's, constantly remind us that genuine humility and a keen eye for observing the natural world hold far more value than a chest full of gold nuggets. They serve as a stark reminder that the modest folks, those wise enough to actively listen to their grandparents and respect the raw laws of Mother Nature, frequently spot the vital truths that the arrogant elite remain entirely blind to. If this incredible tale of frontier justice struck a chord deep in your soul, be sure to hit that like button and pass it along to someone out there who desperately needs to hear that an alternative route genuinely exists. An alternative path that completely bypasses wealth and brute strength, relying heavily instead on ancestral wisdom, quiet patience, and the silent, unbreakable courage required to build the exact structures that the masses dismiss as impossible. Because when the dust finally settles and the howling tempest strikes, the only detail that truly matters isn't who boasted the fanciest mansion or the most freshly painted storage shack. The only thing that dictates who lives and who dies is who happens to possess bone-dry firewood. And, more importantly, who possessed enough humility to learn that vital lesson long before it proved far too late.